Welcome to The Right Angle, the podcast that's all things English and fantasy. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Abby, and today we're diving into two of the most essential parts of any fantasy story, world building and magic systems.
Whether you're creating vast empires, tiny villages, or entire magical ecosystems, good world building makes your story feel alive.
And your magic system, whether it's structured or mysterious, can make or break how believable that world feels.
So in today's episode, we're unpacking what makes a world work, how to make it immersive, how to balance rules with wonder, and how to build a story that feels both magical and real. So what is world building? Well, to put it simply, it's building the reality of your story. So the geography, the culture, the politics, the religion, the language, and the history. But the purpose of world building isn't just about aesthetics. It should reinforce theme and character.
We've talked a little bit about world building on this podcast before, especially in the context of D&D, but even if it's not blatantly obvious, every single fantasy story, or rather every single story that takes place in some sort of a fictional place, even if it's just a fictional small town, has some level of world building, and the fantasy genre especially so. So what do we mean when we say world building is everywhere in fantasy? Well, let's use an example we have circled back to quite a lot, the example that birthed what we consider to be modern fantasy, Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien, as we discussed quite a lot in our episode with Dr. Hartman, if you haven't listened, go check that one out. It's really good. Tolkien was an incredible world builder. He specifically went in depth and created a whole conlang. So a conlang is short for a constructed language. So a language that was not formed through the natural linguistic processes that make a language, such as the thousands of years of history that led English to be what it is today. A conlang is when someone sits down and goes, let's make a language, and they consciously build it, usually for the purposes of fiction. But Tolkien, being this great linguist, wanted to create a conlang. So he did. And a lot of that conlang informed what the rest of the world of The Lord of the Rings, the Shire. Additionally, another aspect of world building that Tolkien kind of set precedent for is the people of this world. In fantasy, there's a lot of room to play with races and species of humanoids, and obviously not every character in The Lord of the Rings is human. There are hobbits, and hobbits I think are mostly akin to halflings in the modern fantasy sphere, in D&D terms, if you will. They are just short humans with a specific culture, second breakfast and all that. That's oversimplified, of course, but you also have elves being these very stoic, very academic, ancient people, but when you think about it, they're not like, Keebler elves, where they're these like tiny little sprite guys. They're like very tall and have long flowing blonde hair and pointed ears. And that's kind of, become a standard for fantasy ever since then. Another aspect of world building that Autumn mentioned earlier is history. Now, history in this sense would be all of the events that took place in this world before the story happened. Now, we won't get into the intense, lengthy history of the world of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because then we'd be here for another 2 hours. But just know it's very fleshed out and very intentional. And the thing that I think Tolkien does very good at is he takes all of these world building elements, and they're not just there for the sake of having this fantasy world. They're there because they enforce the themes, they enforce character moments. They're very intentional and they work to great effect.
So another series that is very in-depth world building is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. And what Harry Potter does really well is take this modern real world, so England in 1990s to the early 2000s, and weave magic into our world in a way that makes sense. And it showcases how magic is a part of everyday life, because you have your normal non-magical people, your muggles, who are living oblivious to this whole other secret world of magic, wizards and witches, who all get to go to school at this mystical place called Hogwarts that is just so out of the ordinary and strange and filled with magic and filled with wonder. And how our main character, Harry Potter, was living this world as a normal boy, and then he's brought into this magical school. And I think that's what really connected with so many of us and why we enjoyed the books so much growing up, because we could all be Harry Potter. We could fit in those shoes. We could be that ordinary, mundane kid who one day gets brought into this cool, magical world.
World building terminology note for you guys. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter are a good range of examples to help explain what the terms high fantasy and low fantasy mean. Now, high fantasy and low fantasy are just markers of where the world takes place. Now, what do I mean by that? In high fantasy, it is a world that is completely separate from our own. And, it has nothing to do with the timeline of Earth and the lived events that have actually happened within the span of time that we are a part of. Now, low fantasy does, in some capacity, take place on Earth, or some version of it, and it may or may not involve events that have actually happened within history. Now, the thing about high fantasy and low fantasy is, while those are two distinct terms, I like to think of it more as a spectrum rather than two extremes, because not every fantasy story falls on those two extremes. Harry Potter, for example, I would say probably falls way more on the low fantasy side. While yes, the magic system it has and the fantastical elements are very rich, and there's a lot of them, it very obviously takes place in our world within a very specific time period, and it doesn't really alter the events of history too much. It's very clearly low fantasy. Now, Lord of the Rings, it's kind of contentious where it falls on this spectrum aesthetically, and if you kind of remove the lore and history, it's a very high fantasy. But technically, Lord of the Rings has connections with the real world. I won't get into it too much, but just know it's a little kind of in the middle on that spectrum.
So to put it a little bit more concisely, high fantasy takes place in a completely fictional world that has tons of fictional elements that actively influence the story and the plot heavily, while low fantasy takes place in a more realistic or normal world where these fantastical elements are implemented a little bit into this seemingly normal life. But with that said, fantasy isn't the only genre to have heavy world building. Every genre does, as Abby said before. So let's take a look at a dystopian example.
I think an example that a lot of people are very familiar with that has excellent world building is the Hunger Games series. Now, the Hunger Games series, I know it's not fantasy, but it does take place in an imagined future after the United States of America has collapsed. And so it takes place, in North America, on the geographical locations of America, but the government and the boundaries of each district are completely different than what we know. Now, one thing that I think is different about how world building is utilized in dystopia versus fantasy. Fantasy world building is usually used to drive the plot, create a sense of wonder, just create a fun world. Dystopia, world building is often used to create social commentary about our real world. And the Hunger Games social commentary is created through the structure of this country, Panem. Now, some of you may know this, but for those of you who don't, I'll get into it a little bit. The capital is this sprawling city, and it is the capital of Panam. It's in the name. And the residents there are very rich, elite socialites. They have all the resources to live more than comfortably, and they're kind of famous for dressing very strangely and extravagantly. They are the representation of excess, and that's just a very small portion of Panam's population, because every other district has one main resource that they are in charge of collecting. I don't quite remember how it maths out, but there are 12 districts. There used to be 13, but it's a lore thing. You can Google it. There are like in-depth analyses and like maps you can find online that are pretty cool. But for example, the district that a lot of the story takes place in, District 12, they extract coal, and District 12 is built on the ruins of rural Appalachia. And all of these districts, for the most part, kind of live in poverty, and their sole purpose is to get resources for this capital to live these like lives of splendor and excess that they want to. And this is a social commentary about the state of America and how often America will exploit, impoverished countries to get the resources so that we can live in excess. That's just a very brief overview of how that world building can create social commentary. It goes a lot deeper than that. So if you're interested in that, I would just recommend reading those books. But now that we've kind of talked about world building examples, let's kind of talk about some common pitfalls. So some mistakes you might run into trying to world build yourself, and mistakes that we may have run into with our own world building.
One of the first common pitfalls that I can think of when world building is this idea of map syndrome. So this idea of creating a map for your world, which is not a bad idea. It's actually really helpful if you're doing things that take place across multiple locations, so you and your readers get an idea of where everything is. But sometimes that can lead to us as authors spending hours naming places and developing lore for places that in the end aren't really relevant within the story and never really get brought up. It's a fun exercise to do for sure, to like help get you thinking about the world and making it more in depth. But when you're crafting a story, you got to think about what is going to be relevant and what's going to come up within the plot. What does the reader and the main characters need to know about this world versus what's just kind of fun for us as the authors to think about.
I have a brief question for you, Autumn, on this map syndrome and, creating physical locations within your world. As someone who is a really experienced writer and a really experienced DM, how would you say that crafting the physical locations differs while you're world building for a written work versus a D&D campaign?
There's a big difference there. So when you're doing it for a D&D campaign, honestly, spend the hours naming the places, because you're at the mercy of other people and they might randomly one day decide to go to that place. And it's good to have an idea of what is there so that when they show up, it's not just, oh shoot, oh no, and then you don't have anything. So having more of a concrete idea of that would be really helpful. So something I did is the places that I knew the party was going to 100%, I mapped out completely fully. And then nearby locations, I would have kind of bullet points and of rough ideas of what those places might be like. And I would figure the details out a little bit later if it looked like we were actually going to that location. Versus in my own writing, I don't do really much with maps. My characters do actually traverse 2 different locations within the story. They go from one town to another town, and I only focus on those 2. and the world building of those two towns, because everything else you can kind of just put up a little curtain because the reader's never going to see that. They don't need to know what's behind this little curtain. There's nothing there. But also, one thing that I'm really trying to incorporate a little bit more is this world building of surrounding countries, because I did mention somewhere early on in my story that there's a war going on, and then I got to writing and I realized there are no effects of these wars. Like, none of these towns are named, none of these countries and kingdoms that are at war are named, and I don't know anything about them. And so taking a step back and being like, oh, I wanted to make this a relevant part of the plot, so I need to add to it to make it relevant.
I think that is an excellent way to transition into another one of our pitfalls, and that would be creating world building that does not affect the plot or affect other elements of world building. You just have these details there because they're cool, and then they don't affect one another as they would in a real society. Granted, being aware of the intersectionality of language and cultures and country borders and governmental systems is a lot to keep track of. And it's something that if you're not careful, you can just rabbit hole to the point where you're not writing your story. But it is essential to creating a believable world and to creating world building that actually affects the plot.
I 100% agree with that. I know I've read stories where they've just been kind of showing things and I'm like, okay, well, this will definitely be relevant later. And then it wasn't. And I know in my gut that that was the author having a really cool idea and wanting to say it because it was genuinely cool, but not having a way to incorporate it and make it more relevant with the story, which as a reader isn't as satisfying, because I love when authors take cool world building aspects and implement them and I can see where they're going with it. I want to be a part of this world and I want to see it, and it's really cool when we get to, but I sometimes fall victim of this too. You just want to add something that you thought of and you're like, oh, this is so cool. I'll do something with it later. I'll definitely do something with it later, and then you don't. And then that ends up sticking around and leaving readers a little bit confused.
Oh, absolutely. So to kind of combine both of those pitfalls into some practical advice, if you do ever find yourself writing and world building, which we both think is a wonderful endeavor to attempt, think about being intentional. Think about what is essential, what your characters will interact with, and the ripple effect. So if you're going to write about a war, think about how that may affect the price of grain, or some people's religious beliefs about the war, or the government power, things like that. But make sure that your world building enhances your story instead of becoming this extensive encyclopedia that no one will really know about but you.
So once you've got your setting built, the next step is deciding how magic works inside it.
Right, because a good magic system isn't just about how cool the powers are. It's about the logic or the mystery that makes your world believable.
So let's get into magic systems. What are they? They're a set of rules, or sometimes lack of rules, that governs how magic functions in your world.
So I feel as though you can't talk about the concept of magic systems without talking about my favorite fantasy author, Brandon Sanderson. He has this set of world building laws that he kind of coined, and the one about magic systems is Sanderson's first law, and it reads, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. Now, what does he mean by that? Now, this goes into that intentionality we were talking about earlier. Sanderson is proponing that if you don't use your magic to solve problems, to solve conflict as a part of the driving force of the plot, your readers will not understand how your magic works. Another thing Brandon Sanderson kind of coined are the two types of magic systems. hard magic systems versus soft magic systems. Now, what do I mean by that? A hard magic system is a magic system with very direct, explicitly stated rules. For one of my favorite examples of a hard magic system is his Mistborn series. Now, for those of you who may not have heard of it or read it, this is a physics-based magic system. So I won't explain all the ins and outs because otherwise we'll be here for another 45 minutes. It's very complicated and in depth. But one type of magic user can push and pull pieces of metal, but it's not like they can just move the metal around wherever they want willy-nilly like, your average telekinesis. No, they can only push directly away from them or pull directly towards them. And that kind of creates this physics-based range of abilities that these magic users can use. They often will take a handful of coins and shoot them out, like almost akin to like bullets out of a gun, directly in front of them, to harm their enemies. They also have the ability to fly, not through, the magic just lets them fly. No, what they'll do is they will push off of bits of metal below them. And because the force cannot, like, for example, if you're pushing off of a coin that is on the ground, that coin cannot go through the ground. So that force is going to propel the magic user upwards, so they kind of quasi get to fly. But that is a hard magic system where there are rules, and often they're the most complicated to understand. Some people really dig that. I really dig it. Some people are not huge fans of it, and that's why we have soft magic systems. Now, soft magic systems are magic systems where there are not explicit rules, and the author can use this magic to kind of do whatever. Granted, when I say the author can use the magic to do whatever, I don't mean literally whatever. Obviously, writers will know that their magic has limits, but the reader does not explicitly know fully what the magic is capable of. They only know moment by moment what each character can do. I think a really good example of this is the Narnia series. It's always a mystery what the magic in that world is capable of until someone uses it again. Like the Ice Queen's powers. You don't fully know what she's capable of until she uses her abilities. But neither of these systems are better. Obviously, it depends on your story's tone or purpose. And similar to high fantasy and low fantasy, I believe that hard magic system, soft magic system is kind of a spectrum.
So one example that is almost kind of a hybrid of hard and soft magic is the animated series Avatar: The Last Airbender. So you have this clear, defined system of what are called benders, and these are people who can take the four elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and utilize those elements to do various things. So firebenders, they can shoot off flames from the palm of their hand, and airbenders can incorporate the wind in a way that allows them to fly. But there's also this aspect of spiritual mystery surrounding what we call the Avatar. So in this world, there are these different countries where these benders kind of originate, and they all kind of stick around there. And each bender can only bend one element. So you have earthbenders, and the only element they can interact with is earth. But you have this figure called the Avatar, which can bend all four elements. And they're kind of seen as this heroic figure in the world. They're born every generation. So when one dies, that very second they die, a new avatar is born, and continues this cycle of having this heroic figure who can bend all of these elements, and they can do things in a way that the audience doesn't fully understand. Like, the avatar can actually connect spiritually with past avatars who have long since perished, and gain information and skills from them, and sometimes are even possessed by an old avatar and utilize their powers for a little bit. And so it's this really cool bend of very hard, strict rules, but then you have a little bit of soft, a little bit of mysterious, a little bit of mysticism that adds to the overall world building. And while we as the audience understand some aspects of this world, there are still things that we don't know, and that drives us to want to keep watching and to keep learning how this magic works.
We could go on and on about how cool magic systems are and how, honestly, they're my favorite aspect of world building. But in-depth world building, whether it's high fantasy or low fantasy, and the use of magic systems, whether they're hard magic system, soft magic system, or anywhere in between, is what makes the fantasy genre so distinct and why we love it. So whether you're writing a sprawling epic or a single small town fantasy, your world and your magic should feel like they belong to each other.
Build with intention, ask questions, and remember that every rule you make should make your world more alive.
Thank you all for listening. And if you liked today's episode, be sure to follow The Right Angle on Spotify or YouTube.
And check out our Instagram for updates and behind the scene content and the occasional meme about procrastinating your world map.
Well, that's it from The Right Angle, where we know the real magic isn't just in the story, it's in those who write it too.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically, and stay weird.